Afternoon, everybody. Awesome. Good afternoon. How you guys doing? My name's Nick Campagna, part of the Palo Alto Network's product management team. And today, I'm going to be co-presenting with Ashwath Murthy on strengthening your internet gateway. How many of you noticed the QR code on our title slide? Yeah? You got one click? Anybody else? No? You're missing out. What we were doing here is called a Rickroll. That's where you trick people into accessing a horrible 80s rock video. But anyway, take a snapshot of it, do it later on. So as we go through the presentation, we have additional QR codes set up that don't Rickroll you, I promise. All of those are meant to point you towards useful best practice documentation. And that's going to be useful because after you leave here today, 2 and 3 weeks from now, you're not going to retain any of the very specific recommendations that we have. But we wanted to make sure and leave you all with the tools and the resources you need to be able to go and implement these best practices. So somebody asked me what we were doing with these T-shirt cannons. Were we trying to drum up a better rating for our session or trying to bribe the audience? The truth is that we just never shot T-shirt cannons before, so we thought we'd give it a shot. So who wants a free T-shirt? Anybody else? We got one over here? Woo! Don't worry, there's more T-shirts to come. All right. Good shot, Ash. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Ash to kick us off, and I want to thank you guys very much for your time joining us for this Internet Gateway Best Practices session.
All right, thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Ashwath Murthy. I'm a part of the product management team, and I focus on all the fun bits of the next generation firewall. I look after App ID, User ID, things that put Palo Alto Networks on the map and made us the original and true OG next generation firewall. We thought we'd talk to you about a few things today, specifically from the standpoint of an internet gateway, and what you should be doing to strengthen your internet gateway security policy. And to do this, we thought we'd take a little bit of a different approach as compared to what you might have just seen with Eric Youngins and John Harrison. We thought we'd start by helping you understand how your adversaries work. Be it Darth Vader, who's running the Death Star, or the evil emperor, or a cyber adversary who might be coming after your users and your data, getting a view into how these adversaries work and what their playbook might look like, and how they actually get about compromising networks is a fundamental asset that all of you as cybersecurity practitioners can have. If you do develop this understanding, and when you do develop this understanding, something that you can do is start mapping out a plan to defend against it. How do you actually defend against an adversary who might be coming after your users, or someone who's coming after your data, or someone who might just be using the internet as a delivery vehicle to try and get malware into your network? You can start figuring these things out and build out a defense mechanism to protect your users and your assets and your data against these attacks. As Nick just mentioned, we're going to cover a lot of best practices here, and we absolutely do not expect you to retain all of that in your brains. Take photographs if you want, but something that we wanted to do was make sure that we get you the pointers you need. This isn't me, right? We just wanted to make sure that we get you the pointers you need to help you guys figure this out as you think about this through the course of the next few days and the next few weeks, and very specifically ensure that you know where to turn to get help as you get on with this journey of strengthening your internet gateway. Now, you guys saw this a couple times already. You saw this with Lee Clatch's session. You saw this being mentioned by Eric Youngins and John Harrison just a few minutes ago. We've believed in this for many, many years as the only and successful way to prevent a cyber attack. You have to start with complete visibility. You cannot defend against something that you cannot see or something that you do not know. You have to try and reduce the attack surface to something that's manageable, that is known good to you as a business and to your users as they consume services from the internet. Us as a cybersecurity industry, we have to prevent everything that is known to be bad. And we also have the responsibility to detect anything that isn't known yet and turn it into known signatures as quickly as possible. From an internet gateway perspective, though, something that needs to happen is that this needs to apply consistently across all locations. And the location is no longer just the corporate headquarters, but includes many other things, including aspects that you may not be thinking about, such as IoT. It includes remote workers, workloads in the private cloud and public cloud, and it also includes critical applications that are being served from the internet, like SaaS. Now, this goes to the question, what is an internet gateway anymore? How do you define an internet gateway? And in the past, something that would happen is that you would have, if my clicker would work, there we go. In the past, you'd just have an internet POP and a security device connected to the internet POP, a whole host of users behind it, and that would be your internet gateway. And this typically took on the form of users at your headquarters, either being backhauled through VPN or physically at headquarters, all going through what would be an internet gateway firewall on their way to the internet to read ESPN.com on a Monday morning for football blogs, or to look at Yahoo Finance, or to trade some stocks on E-Trade. However, the notion of an internet gateway has evolved in the past few years, starting with the user population. They're no longer just at your headquarters, but they're now split between your headquarters, remote offices and branches. There are 100 or so Palo Networks employees here in Anaheim this week. We're all remote workers, and we're all typically just lodged up at hotels. A worker might be at a hipster coffee shop sipping up Cascara, and if you don't know what Cascara is, look it up. It is the latest hipster coffee trend. They might be sipping on a $4 latte while getting their work done, and this needs to be considered a perimeter. They could be remote workers who are coming in from home, and all these remote workers are a part of your internet perimeter defense strategy. From an internet perspective as well, it's no longer just a news site or a sports blog or a stock trading application. The internet and the notion of the internet has evolved to carry mission-critical applications to business like SaaS. Those of you who are using either mail services from Google or mail services from Office or Microsoft with Office 365, you guys are storing identities in the cloud. You have single sign-on being delivered from the cloud. You have multi-factor authentication that's being delivered from the cloud, ergo the internet. This represents an attack surface that you need to think about and that you need to develop and build a defense strategy for. Lastly, as we heard this morning, a lot of organizations are using lift and shift or are naturally evolving applications to go into the public cloud. And as these applications evolve and move into the public cloud, an application that would have typically resided within your data center is now available in AWS or Azure, which means as a developer and as an application consumer, you now have the flexibility to open up this application to broad use. Instead of making it accessible just through a local network, app developers, DevOps teams, and infrastructure crew now have the option to open up access to this application and allow for these applications to be accessed from the internet. So what would be, back in the day, a traditional internal application is also a potential here and could also be a part of this frontline defense that you need to think about when it comes to an internet gateway. From the perspective of the security device that performs this function, through the past several years, products from Palo Networks have also evolved. What used to just be a hardware device, a 3000 series device or a 5000 series device that you would lob out there as an internet gateway, could now take on the form of a VM series instance that's running in a branch office. As you heard this morning from Adam Geller, this could be Global Protect or Global Protect Cloud Services that is securing your vast remote workforce or vast geographically distributed workforces. We also introduced this notion of SAML proxy. If you have an unmanaged device and a user is getting out to Office 365, how do you control access? It is the internet gateway, and you have sensitive data in email. How do you control that? And the notion of a SAML proxy, combined with the likes of a clientless VPN solution, form a fundamental component of your cyber defense strategy for an internet gateway. From an attacker's perspective, though, as you heard in the past session with Eric and John, not a whole lot has changed. They're still using exploit kits. They're still abusing protocols such as TLS and DNS. With the Drupal demo that you just saw from John and Eric, they're exploiting known vulnerabilities where all you got to do is load up a toolkit and list out the CVEs that you could potentially exploit. Credential theft is a huge vector for those attackers who are targeting specific enterprises and are looking to do the most damage. And lastly, old school tactics like spear phishing or trying to get a user to download malware haven't really gone out of fashion. They still exist. Attackers use these as techniques to try and break in from the internet and compromise your systems, your users, and your data. So with that,
thanks, Ash. So now that Ash has given us a sense for how the internet gateway has evolved or how it needs to evolve, and really what our exposure is there, I want to start to answer the question of how we can strengthen our security posture at that internet gateway. And the way we're going to do this is by taking a look at a few attacks, specific network breaches. We're going to break those down and see how internet gateway capabilities map into the various steps required to succeed with those network breaches. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Office of Personnel Management. And the reason why we chose this one is because there's a lot of information available about this particular breach based on a House of Representatives report that was published on this. So I'll refer to this from now on as OPM. OPM, if you're not familiar with it, is a government institution that's, among many other things, responsible for conducting background investigations. So if somebody wants to get a security clearance, maybe they want to work on as a defense contractor or work in cybersecurity in the government or so many other things, that's the kind of data that OPM is dealing with. And if you don't know what this process looks like, it starts by essentially providing every bit of personal data that you have on your past employment records, where you've lived for the past 10 years or more. At the highest levels, people even divulge, they even contain interview scripts. Basically, interviews conducted with both personal and professional relationships that the individual looking to achieve the clearance would have. And so if we look at this type of data, clearly it's really valuable for any kind of espionage or counter-espionage operation. And so naturally, with this construct we're going to use here called the attack tree, we start at the top layer with the primary objective, which here is to steal sensitive information. The second level are the secondary objectives required to be able to achieve the primary objective. If I want to steal that information, first I need to get into the network, I need to grab that sensitive data, and then I need to be able to exfiltrate that to make use of it. So let's take a look at exactly how that broke down. So in OPM, things really started a few years back where there were actually two concurrent network breaches happening at the same time, one of which the organization was aware of, and the other was not. The first one, which the House report calls Hacker X1, resulted in a relatively minor breach where effectively a few manuals relating to IT infrastructure were exfiltrated from the network. And because that attacker started getting close to the background investigation information, OPM successfully extricated them from the network. The second attack, unfortunately, resulted in much more dire circumstances. Hacker X2, again, I didn't apply these monikers, but the House committee applied them. Hacker X2 was successful in exfiltrating more than 21 million background investigation reports, all that sensitive information I just described. They also pulled out over 5 million fingerprint records and over 4 million personnel records, all incredibly valuable information. And as far as we know, most of this data hasn't been monetized. So you can imagine that this is for much more nefarious purposes than making a quick buck by taking over folks' identities and trying to be able to make money on that process. So effectively, it started out with a third-party contractor called Keypoint that was helping OPM to conduct background investigations. The attacker was successful in compromising that third-party contractor and used credentials from that contractor to make their way into the OPM network over a VPN connection. From there, they landed on a SQL server. They were able to get access to a jump server that sat on the inside of a very secure network. And they achieved persistence there by installing something called PlugX malware. This is a pretty cool remote access toolkit that includes modular capabilities. You can build on top of it to add a number of different functions to be able to improve the level of capability that that malware provides. From there, they were able to expand laterally, moving across closer and closer to this really sensitive data using RDP to be able to access other systems inside the network. Ultimately, the attackers registered, I believe it's 3 domains that were used for both command and control and data exfiltration. And crucially, these command and control domains were not clear text. These were not, in this case, DNS used to tunnel command and control communications. They actually used SSL to secure those communications and disguise everything that they're trying to do in these networks. And ultimately, the attacker, once they were able to move close to this data, they gathered together all of the background investigations data, all the fingerprint data, encrypted that into RAR archive formats, and they were able to exfiltrate that out of the network. Over the span of 8 months, they continued to exfiltrate data, including background investigations, fingerprints. They were also able to move towards Department of Interior servers that held the personnel records for federal government employees. So this breach didn't simply stop, as described, inside the OPM network. So let's take a look at what we can actually do as countermeasures. Some of these are internet gateway specific, some are not, and we'll relate these back to specific best practices that you can apply to be able to counter techniques like these. The first, and we're going to look at these from an OPM perspective. Clearly, they can't stop a third-party contractor's network from being breached if they don't have a presence there. So starting with the attacker's access into the OPM network, of course, they could employ two-factor authentication, so that even if an attacker were successful in achieving or obtaining credentials to the OPM network, they wouldn't be able to access it remotely over a VPN with that second factor. Similarly, they could have done a much stronger job of segmenting and isolating vendor access, so they can't get to all this incredibly sensitive information that's available inside of OPM. Second, when we look at the PlugX malware, there are a number of different capabilities that can help here. The first is antivirus, which would be able to stop any known variants of the PlugX malware. Second is WildFire. WildFire is all about sending files like these, uncovering unknowns, and then delivering preventions to stop them. And the third is Traps. As we saw this morning in Liat's session, Traps has a number of capabilities that apply in this case, including execution prevention, tie into WildFire, as well as static analysis techniques that operate on the endpoint. In terms of lateral movement, again, the attackers in this case used RDP to move laterally onto other systems. So here we can look towards App ID, simple App ID controls and policy to be able to limit that access. A feature that we released in a fairly recent version of PanOS is our authentication policy, which would allow you to add additional multi-factor authentication challenges for any communications to the most sensitive data. And because this is implemented at the network level, it's very simple to get this deployed in front of any sensitive system, provided you have proper segmentation. The last thing is magnifier, which again we saw a bit on this morning, which would be effective in detecting anomalous behaviors that aren't corresponding to that typical user behavior profile. As far as exfiltration and command and control, here we look to a combination of anti-spyware to be able to block resolution of known bad domains, as well as command and control communications payloads. Anti-spyware doesn't just rely on observing known bad domains, but it also understands the communications between the compromised system and the command and control service. PanDB here as well comes into play, especially if we had the opportunity to see these similar samples through WildFire and populate PanDB with additional information. Lastly, the encryption and exfiltration. This comes back to a couple of factors, one of which you heard in the previous session. If the attackers really did pull together data in encrypted RAR files, that can easily be blocked with file blocking. Similarly, you can use App ID. As they're using TLS to go back into their own command and control infrastructure, you have an opportunity there to be able to block that traffic. Beyond that, you could even use the decryption profile. Throw your hands up if you're familiar with the capability in SSL decryption to block access to sites with untrusted certificates. That's pretty good. How many of you know that you can do that without even doing decryption? A little bit less. It's true. All right, so we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at a different type of attack, one that has a very different motive, in this case, ransomware. So here, instead of looking for incredibly sensitive data, the attacker's just looking to make a quick buck. So the steps here require breaching the endpoint, encrypting the data there, and of course, result in extorting the user. So the attack often works out like this. First, the attacker draws the user to a malicious website. This could be through a phishing campaign. It could be through a malicious advertisement. Any number of different methods can get the user to that website, or an exploit kit, or typically an exploit kit could be used to select the appropriate exploit to deliver to that end user. In our case, maybe it's a flash vulnerability that's being exploited. Now, once that's brought down to the endpoint, that vulnerability would be exploited, giving the attacker an opportunity to execute a dropper, which would then reach out to command and control infrastructure, pull down a ransomware payload, and ultimately run that payload on the system. Finally, encryption of the data and extortion of the user results. So what can we do using Internet Gateway to counter these things? First, drawing that user to a malicious website, we have a number of capabilities. You can use PanDB, which is a way that, assuming we have some prior knowledge of that site, we can actually block access to it. We also have DNS signatures populated by WildFire. So if there's any linkage to any other samples that use similar command and control infrastructure, if it's on a site stood up by the attacker themselves, we have an opportunity to stop it here. And of course, passive DNS monitoring as well gives us additional data that we can use to push signature-based preventions into our platform. On the flash exploit delivery, of course, here we're looking towards vulnerability protection, typically known as IPS. Here we're able to actually recognize and stop the exploit kit itself to block that delivery of exploits of client-side vulnerabilities. In terms of actually blocking the exploit from being successful on the endpoint, here we would fall back to Traps, where Traps uses its exploit prevention modules to prevent that exploit from being successful on the endpoint. Now, if we then look at the dropper pulling a malware payload back onto the system, here we have a couple opportunities to block that based on command and control. The first is using PanDB, again, if we have some data in this case, to be able to block C2, to be able to block the domain itself or the URL. And in terms of blocking the ransomware payload, again, we can come back to file blocking and antivirus, as well as WildFire, as other opportunities to discover unknown attacks and prevent those that we already know about. Now, in terms of running the ransomware payload, here we look to Traps to be able to run execution prevention. And in terms of encryption, Liat talked about this a bit this morning, Traps has the ability to recognize when ransomware is taking hold on a system and to be able to prevent that attack. So let's now shift gears a little bit and take a look at what does this actually mean on the next-gen firewall? What do we put in there to be able to counter these attacks? First is the file blocking profile. I think John mentioned this 2 or 3 times in the previous presentation because it is such an important tool in the tool set and because it's so seldom used. So file blocking presents an opportunity to reduce that attack surface. What that means is we can be able to potentially block file types that are liable to be used by these attacks, especially when those aren't needed by the user population. This is going to be a really aggressive file blocking profile is going to be most useful in a highly secured environment. Now, we want to be able to do this without impacting that user, and we want it to work both for user and threat-initiated downloads. So in both of our examples, the user didn't just go and download plugx malware, didn't go and download ransomware payload. That was initiated by the compromised system itself. So our specific recommendations here are to block those file types that are commonly associated with malicious intent, used to carry malware. And on top of that, to be able to alert on all other file types, to be able to provide forensics information that can be used in the future on many other tools on the application framework, and today inside Panorama, inside a SIM, whatever you happen to use for investigations. Next is URL filtering. So with URL filtering, we have an opportunity to prevent known and unknown attacks, including exploits and malware that are identified, including command and control infrastructure, and even the submission of valid credentials. This is done through URL filtering capabilities on PAN-OS and allows us an opportunity to block a credential phishing attack even if we have no prior knowledge of that infrastructure used to steal those credentials. We want to do all this while capturing valuable forensics data. For example, with URL filtering, we can capture user agent strings, refer, other information that's part of those HTTP transactions that will be incredibly useful for investigating or providing forensics later on. Our recommendations here are pretty straightforward as well. Block those known malicious categories or those with malicious intent. Here we're talking about phishing, malware, talking about command and control, all PAN-DB URL filtering categories. If you're still thinking of URL filtering as a way to keep people from having a good time on the internet, you're missing the boat big time. There's a lot of security capability built into PAN-DB based on all the intelligence that's delivered by WildFire. And how many samples did Lee say this morning we saw? 5.3 billion over time. So there's a ton of intelligence that's then fed back into our URL filtering solution to help block those known malicious locations. Second is to continue on risky categories. So this presents an opportunity for the user to recognize that they're doing something risky, which could be accessing a hacking website, something straightforward like that. And finally, alerting on the rest to be able to provide, again, a forensics trail, which will be useful later on. So with vulnerability protection profiles, we're looking to be able to prevent known attacks which help with the initial compromise, either on the client side, as in the internet gateway case, or on the server side. We'll also help with lateral movement. In some cases, you see these same vulnerabilities exploited on the inside to be able to move to different systems and get closer to valuable data, as in the OPM case. Doing all this while gathering forensic evidence. So our recommendations here to be able to be successful in that are to grab the strict profile, which is predefined on your devices, modify that, clone that, so that you're blocking medium, high, and critical severity threats, but also enable packet captures, once again for forensic purposes. All right. With antivirus here, pretty clear, we're looking to prevent known malware. From any source, from any application, it's critical. When we talk about complete visibility, we're talking about being able to block threats inside any application. We want to be able to do this even if the user didn't initiate the transfer. Pointing back to our OPM case and our ransomware case, both of these resulted in the download of additional payloads that the user would never see on the owner of that compromised system. So our recommendations here are for both the antivirus signatures as well as the WildFire signatures to reset both sides of the connection in these cases. This allows us to make sure that that malicious file is not actually going to make it to the endpoint. We want to do this for all protocols to make sure that we have every opportunity to prevent the transmission of that threat. There is also a predefined default antivirus profile. Do not use it. It's there so that you can clone it and customize it to make it a little bit easier to deploy these best practices that I've just laid out. So as part of the best practice checks that was up on the slide this morning, that case that we saw, an AV profile was actually using the default profile. So something that I want to make sure that nobody in this room has on their systems. Next is wildfire analysis. Here, of course, we're looking to uncover new, unknown malicious files, deliver prevention throughout many steps of the attack lifecycle. So we don't just have an opportunity to block the malware, but its command and control infrastructure, any additional payloads it may pull down through the process. In doing all this while still being able to discover compromised systems that may have obtained that same malicious file through other means. And our best practice here is very simple. Forward everything to WildFire. Not everybody in this room is going to be able to do this. Some of you will be in highly regulated industries where you're not able to send every single sample. So in these cases, we'd recommend use of the WF500 for an on-premise solution. And last is anti-spyware, which is really designed to prevent post-compromise activity. Here we're looking to be able to identify and block the resolution of known bad domains, as well as to conduct payload-based command and control identification. It's really easy for an attacker to change IPs. It's really easy for an attacker to change domain names. What's more difficult is changing the language spoken between the compromised system and the command and control infrastructure. So our best practice here is to use the strict profile to reset medium, high, and critical vulnerability or critical severity threats, but also to be able to block or sinkhole those events. Now, if your firewall doesn't reside in between your end machine that's being compromised and your DNS infrastructure, it's not going to see the source IP of the system that's attempting to be compromised or that has already been compromised. So that's where you want to implement sinkhole to make sure that you have another means to identify those systems that have already been compromised. Now, it feels like there's something that we haven't gotten to, right? We talked about all the different security profiles, which are meant to help block many different steps in the attack lifecycle, but there's something missing. And that something is TLS. TLS is secure, right? I see a lot of nods. People agree it's secure. Google stats here show us that TLS is used well over 50% of the time, so that's a good thing. Unfortunately, that padlock doesn't just mean payload security. It doesn't just mean that somebody is not going to be able to look at your traffic and scrape your passwords for most people. 80% of people, according to Phish Labs, think that that padlock means that you're going to a legitimate site and that the site is safe. There's no malware there. There are no exploits housed there. That's pretty unfortunate. And there are people taking advantage of that trend. Also, according to Phish Labs, this is the increase in the use of HTTPS on phishing attacks. Essentially an exponential curve up until the third quarter of 2017. What this chart doesn't show is that now roughly 3/4 of all phishing infrastructure, those domains, are actually registered by the attacker. They're doing this intentionally. They're exploiting the misunderstanding from users that TLS or encryption means secure. In fact, if you go into Google Chrome right now and you go to an HTTPS website, it even says secure right next to the padlock. I just read an article yesterday that they're going to yank that word out of there in September, so that's a good thing. We're all making progress. So with that, I want to pass it back to Ash.
Thanks, Nick. So that was a fantastic overview of what you could be doing right here, right now with security profiles. Remember that the security profiles are elements that you would attach to your existing rules that control traffic that is bound for the internet. Now, these are changes that you can make soon. We want you guys to go make these changes tonight or just as the conference ends. And these are changes that aren't intrusive. These are not changes that dramatically change the way your users connect to or perceive their access to the internet. Decryption, of course, we understand is a little bit of a different story. You need to think about it. You need to plan for it. But again, we have fantastic resources available for you to think about decryption. Our customers here with us at Ignite will be hosting a session on decryption, and they'll be talking about their journey in succeeding at this goal of decrypting traffic that's bound for the internet. With that, I was going to talk about a skeleton in the closet, but Nick convinced me that I should stick with the pink elephant. There's something else that we haven't talked about. How many of your firewalls have rules that look like this on the internet gateway? Come on, hands up. I know you guys have it. Don't lie. Come on. Yeah. This is a problem. TCP/80 is not an approximation for HTTP. TCP 443 is not an approximation for TLS. All of us know this. There are dangerous side effects here. For example, we see a lot of firewalls with UDP 53 enabled because it's approximated to DNS. And in numerous cases, we've seen TCP 445 be open to the internet and also from the internet. And if you're to just focus and drill down on TCP 445 and why this is a huge issue, Karen this morning talked about Eternal Blue and ransomware and what it did to the internet and user systems on the internet through the course of the last year and a half. In the recent TrustWave report, they went out and they simply poked around on the internet and they tried to find out systems that had SMB open. This is access from the internet into your enterprise with SMB open. Of those systems that had SMB v1, 60+% were open to anonymous access or null access, which means you did not need any kind of credentials to get into that system. If you take a look at Microsoft and Microsoft's response to this incident with Eternal Blue, they went out of their way to patch operating systems that were end of life or end of sale. They went out of their way to patch systems that they knew folks were still using. And even with that, even with the patch that Microsoft put out, which is what is referenced by MS17010, they found that over half the systems were still vulnerable to this exploit. So while security profiles and the best practices surrounding security profiles will help with this, and the likes of traps will help you make sure that ransomware does not execute on the system and try and encrypt a drive, basic network hygiene is necessary and is crucially important to strengthening your internet gateway. It starts with segmentation. It's not just user DMZ and the internet, as we saw at the top of this talk, but also using tools like AppID and trying to make sure that you understand what should be allowed out and what should be allowed in should be a fundamental strategy for you as you think about your internet gateways. If instead of TCP 445, we were to ask a question, why would anyone want to have SMB v1 as a protocol open coming in from the internet? The answer is never. If you ask the question the other way and go, well, why would you ever have it go out to the internet? The answer should be never. Now, this is the guys who invented SMB and the team that wrote SMB. And they're pleading the cyber community and the DevOps, InfoSec, IT community to stop using SMB1. It isn't safe. It isn't necessary. People will tell you that it is difficult to remove. Believe us, it's not. Most of our customers who have thought about ransomware have actually gone about doing this. And it's not modern or efficient. Microsoft has evolved on this protocol 3 times now. It's at SMB v3. So have a look at the ACC. Have a look at what your rules are permitting, and think about fundamental aspects like AppID and how it can help you strengthen your internet gateway policies. Now, this is something that we've been talking about for the last 8 to 10 years. This notion of AppID whitelisting and how AppID whitelisting can help you get to a much better place from the standpoint of security. You'd want to permit known sanctioned apps that you've subscribed to or purchased or your users consume. You'd want to use the likes of an application group here so that you have a tight hold on the services that the enterprise is consuming and permit that application group. You'd want to permit applications that your users consume, Facebook, Instagram, other applications that we all love as internet consumers. And make sure that you apply the right security profiles on this, the right file blocking controls, the right URL filtering controls on this, and allow the applications that are necessary for your users to consume services from the internet. And lastly, make sure that you drop unsanctioned applications. Now, if you cannot do this with a default deny rule, like because we're an implicit deny firewall, do it with an explicit rule. There's no reason for DNS traffic from your enterprise to be bound for the internet. There's no reason for any of your users to really be using BitTorrent or UltraSurf or Hamachi or any of these evasive applications. And you can create application filters to manage this within your rule base. And as Palo Alto Networks continues to deliver more and more AppIDs, these rules will hold, and these rules will be automatically updated to include those applications that are contained within those filters. Now, from an attacker's perspective, we saw a couple attacks. We saw the Office of Personnel Management and how that breach worked out, and Nick went through that attack, as well as a ransomware attack in terms of trying to draw a user to a malicious site, exploiting Flash, downloading the dropper, executing it, encrypting the disk, so on and so forth. If you were to look at the kill chain or the attack lifecycle, these 2 attacks more or less follow the traditional steps that are listed on the slide. But back to an attacker's objectives and getting into the mind of an attacker, what are they going after? If what they're going after is to take an action on an objective, take, for example, data theft, and they want to do this with privilege elevation, they want to steal credentials, they want to move laterally, get at data, and take it out. They have ways to circumvent this attack lifecycle and go about it in a way that gets them directly to the target. For example, all you need to do is just go steal a contractor's credentials and try to get on the network. Or they could steal one of your user's credentials, and if VPN isn't two-factor, they have a direct gate into your network. And this is a pretty big attack vehicle that has come to bear in the past few years that has been a component in several successful breaches. I want to highlight one of those, and many of you may be familiar with this. This is from a couple years ago with the Democratic National Committee, who are using email services, and many personnel received an email that looked like this. It looked like a security alert from the email vendor, and it told the user, hey, we've detected some anomalous or malicious activity. Seems to be a logon attempt from Ukraine. You should click this link right now to try and reset your password because this seems suspicious. This is what bit the DNC in one of the breaches that the DNC encountered a couple years ago, where the attack is not 7 or 8 steps of the attack lifecycle. It is really, really simple. You get one user or a handful of users to surrender their credentials. You log onto the service, that is the target, you take what you want, and you leave. It's that simple. How do you defend against an attack like this? How do you defend against an attack that doesn't involve a zero-day or an exploit or malware running on your computer? If it is this simple and this easy to execute, and users are the weakest link, if they give away the credentials, how do you actually defend against this? Let's start with credential phishing emails. The email screenshot that you just saw a while ago. If a next-generation firewall was in path of that, and if that email were to be seen by WildFire somehow, that link would have been sent up to WildFire for analysis. And we'd be analyzing this link to figure out if it's a phishing site. It doesn't matter if it is spear phishing or if it is credential phishing. And if the verdict from WildFire was that it was a phishing site, we'd be feeding that into PanDB to make sure that the URL categorization is updated. And when a user clicks on that link, you would get to the URL filtering block page, as was recommended by Nick just a few minutes ago. If an attacker were to try and harvest credentials, PanOS 8.0 introduced a new innovative feature to make sure that a user within your enterprise isn't unwittingly giving away their credentials. And be using this to try and ensure that your users, even if they do land at the phishing site, and even if it says enter username, old password, new password, confirm password, and then when they click submit, we have the ability to see that and stop that in flight. Something that we wanted to talk to you about was also this notion of, well, if it's a SaaS application, what do you do? What do you do if the user's sitting at home, or if they're on their phone, or if they happen to be in a coffee shop? Basic identity-related actions that you can take, such as enabling two-factor, come into play. However, you would be enabling two-factor with the email vendor. So where does Palo Networks fit in? The SAML proxy that Adam Geller introduced this morning plays a role here. From an unmanaged device, when the user is trying to get to a SaaS application, a SaaS email service, through the integration with the single sign-on system, you can now have the user be silently and simply redirected through a next-generation firewall using clientless VPN. This is a tremendously capable feature and is hugely relevant when you're talking about SaaS applications and BYOD contractor devices and unmanaged devices. And lastly, if someone were to get into your SaaS application and say Salesforce.com, and they're trying to download 8 gigs of data in one go, the likes of offline monitoring or API monitoring with Aperture would be flagging this as questionable or malicious activity, allowing you to take an action on it as this activity is detected, and also make sure that anything that you need to do from an incident response or forensic standpoint is also handled with that. I want to drill in on a couple things here, but to underscore the risk of credentials and why attacks like this are really important for you guys to think about. The DBIR from a couple years ago highlighted these stats, that over 81% of the attacks used either stolen credentials or weak credentials. Now, crucially, from a phishing standpoint, like all of us think about phishing as spear phishing. We think about it as someone getting an email with a PDF attachment, trying to get them to open it, so on and so forth. But credential phishing is on the rise and has been on the rise for multiple years now. Attackers have figured out that they can get a user to respond within 2 minutes of sending out phishing emails, getting them to submit credentials. And if you have a hit rate that says, please enter your password, that's verbatim what the email says, and you can send that to your users, and your users just give away their credentials, why bother with 0 days? Economically, it makes sense for the attacker to go do this. And as all of us are users with pudgy fingers, we're kind of lazy. We reuse passwords all the time, which means from a breach standpoint, it isn't strictly necessary that your enterprise gets popped. A third party might get popped. Their password store gets dumped onto Pastebin. Guess what? Now I have a dictionary, just as Eric demonstrated, and I can try and break into the enterprise with credentials I can guess. Now, these credentials are typically on sale for cents on the dollar. We've seen credentials on sale for as less as 2 cents, 5 cents a bundle. And these are enterprise-grade credentials, not credentials to an internet forum or anything like that. So these attacks are hugely important, principally because of this. From the end goal of an attacker, when they're looking at your targets, when they're looking at your servers, and they're trying to get at the data, the single most successful way they get at this is credentials. When they finally break into that database that Eric showed that had no password, when they get to your file servers, when they get to the OPM data, the way they get there is using credentials. And Karen mentioned it this morning when she talked about Mimikatz and how you could simply use Mimikatz to dump credentials, use those credentials, and move laterally. The user is the weakest link, and your internet gateway defense needs to have a strategy to defend against this. Starting with, let's get the clicker to work. There we go. Starting with making sure that we get better and better and better at identifying and blocking the phishing page. Now, if WildFire or the next generation firewall is in path of email, be it through SMTP or be it through offline analysis or be it through partner integrations with the likes of Proofpoint, WildFire has the ability to inspect links, follow those links to the web page, and figure out if the web page happens to be a phishing page. If it happens to be a phishing page, as is determined by multiple machine learning classifiers, it updates PanDB. And PanDB then updates all of your firewalls and updates the phishing category in the firewall to include this page. Now, the phishing category is updated every 5 minutes, which means those of you who are using PanDB, you guys are getting verdicts down from PanDB's perspective into the phishing category every 5 minutes. So someone in this room somewhere needs to have received an email with that phishing link, and if one user knows about it, then the entire community of Palo Alto networks who are subscribing to PanDB know about this from a phishing perspective. And that's a benefit of the network effect that you get with cloud-delivered security services like WildFire and PanDB. One single incident gives you protections across the board on all of your firewalls that are listening to PanDB updates. Second, when we're looking at this problem, we found a lot of folks talking about things like training, about how you cannot prevent a phishing attempt. You have to train your users out of it. Even if you look at industry reports today, they'll tell you that you have to train your users out of it and you cannot prevent a phishing attempt. Training is invaluable. It is something that must be done. However, your internet gateway also needs to do what it can to prevent the act of phishing. Starting with PAN-OS 8.0, the firewall with user ID can prevent a user from submitting their credentials to a phishing site. User ID, as you guys know, is already integrated with your directory systems. And at the time that the user clicks the submit button on the phishing page, we're able to interact with user ID, figure out if the credentials on the wire are domain credentials, and if they are, we can block these credentials from being submitted. If you think about it from your user standpoint, how many locations on the internet do your users need to submit credentials? Email? Single sign-on? Perhaps some sanctioned SaaS application that isn't tied in with SSO? And maybe your VPN portal or clientless VPN portal. That's it. There's nothing more. There are only a handful of locations that your users really need to get at to surrender their credentials, submit their credentials. And these are for known legitimate purposes. Any other location on the internet, a CDN, for example, has got no business asking for your users' credentials. A form building site, absolutely none. A sports blog, none. So if you think about it, this feature is really easy to deploy. You figure out what is known good, what is legitimate, thereby reducing the attack surface. And then you go ahead and deploy this feature to enable phishing prevention across all other URLs that your users might be accessing. So what do you think, Nick?
All right, so let's talk about what's next and wrap up. First, I wanted to go through a couple of actions that we've actually pre-sorted for you. They go from easiest to most difficult. Number one is familiarize yourself with the resources available to you so that you can understand the best practices for deploying this technology with the most effectiveness possible. I'm going to share a bunch of links with you in a second. If you want to grab a picture of that, it will get you directly back to that information. Also on the way out, we're going to have some little information cards that show the top 10 best practices and that also contain a link to all of our best practices documented on our website. So take a look for that on the way out, if you would. Second thing, attach those best practice security profiles we described. I did not describe them in gory detail, but the documentation that I'm going to link you to in a moment actually has much more specific recommendations that will help to improve your security posture and strengthen your internet gateway. Third, prevent those credential phishing attempts. Make sure that users are not able to submit their credentials to arbitrary websites. It doesn't make sense to allow that, and you have the tools to stop it today. Fourth, incorporate App ID and User ID in policy. Should always be making decisions with the most context available to you in order to provide the best possible security posture. Fifth, let's get a quick show of hands. How many people are using decryption on traffic going out to the internet at all? OK, and how many are doing it for everything that goes out to the internet? That's OK. Sometimes you have to make some trade-offs for privacy purposes. But make sure that if you don't already have plans in place to implement decryption, that you're starting to work on those plans. It's very critical for stopping phishing attacks, exploit delivery, malware. Everything that we just talked about comes back to decryption. So there are two tools that were discussed this morning by Lee Klarich, our Chief Product Officer. The first one was the Best Practice Assessment Tool. This is a tool created by our customer success organization that can actually process your panorama or your firewall configuration and show you the extent to which you're applying these best practices. We'll actually show you if you haven't applied security profiles to some of your rules. And the second tool here is Expedition. Expedition used to be called our migration tool, but is now providing more and more capabilities to help with the implementation and measurement of best practice adoption. We can actually provide recommendations and help to simplify the remediation process to get those best practices deployed through the Expedition tool. I apologize for using the shortened link. You're going to see a bunch of those. And I know that we as an industry hate URL shorteners, but many of these URLs were way too long to fit on the slide and would have been impossible to read. So you're just going to have to trust me on this one. This one points you to our Customer Success Tools landing page. If you want to hear more about the Best Practice Assessment tool, as well as the Expedition tool, we do have either 3 or 4 booths in the Beacon section of the expo hall. Look for Customer Success, look for Expedition, and they can tell you more about those tools. And this is the documentation that we have on all of our best practices. The first link just brings you to our homepage for best practices. Here you can fan out to internet gateway best practices, some of which we discussed, data center best practices, decryption best practices, so many different things. We're always looking to shore up this information so that you have what you need to continue to improve your security. The rest of these links are useful as well. The second link is best practices specific to this session. It's just basically a map for what best practices we talked through. The third is specific to security profile configuration for your internet gateway. So if that's your first stop, if the first thing you want to do when you get home or even before you get a beer tonight is to go in, understand those configurations, put those into profiles on your devices, and get those deployed. And last is specific to best practices. So that's the end of our session. I wanted to thank you so much for your time. Also, in closing, we have about 6 T-shirts left, and I'm not walking out here with any of these in my hands. So if anybody's interested in trying to catch one, throw your hands up, and we'll shoot them at you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, guys.